I do want to ask you about this next segment. As a reminder, this is the go home episode of Nitro before Halloween Havoc 1995. Yes, that Halloween Havoc. And in this particular segment, immediately following the Savage Kurosawa match, we learned from you on commentary, because this is still the era where you're in the seat and not yet Tony Schiavone, that Hulk Hogan, the Giant, and the entire Dungeon of Doom are present in the building when all of a sudden you guys are interrupted by King Curtis. Now, I've always felt like these King Curtis promos, I imagine that they were shot in Hawaii, but this one in particular, I think, was done here in Huntsville. And King Curtis is positioned as almost being the Dungeon of Doom's, I don't know, supplier of wisdom. You know, he's here babbling on in some variation of English, and all of a sudden we see Kevin Sullivan appear with the Giant and Gene Okerlund. And they're talking about this insurance policy. That is, of course, a giant block of ice in the background. And Sullivan is referring to this insurance policy as the Yeti. And he's talking about this being an evil dwelling in Hogan's heart. And Sullivan says he doesn't think there's one bit of goodness left in Hulk Hogan. And the Giant is going to say that he is the real immortal, not Hulk Hogan. And Sullivan promises us that the Yeti will be in Detroit for Halloween Havoc. This is, of course, going to be the debut of the Yeti at Halloween Havoc. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking to yourself, okay, Yeti sounds like the Abominable Snowman. But what we actually got was a guy wrapped up in athletic tape that looked like toilet paper, dressed like a mummy, not really a Yeti. Is this the GHB era of WCW? What's going on here? How does this happen, Eric?
It was a far more successful angle creatively than people give it credit for, because they did name a cooler after him.
Yeah, they did. That's true.
Come on, there's an upside right now. Dude, as you're laying this all out to me and I'm looking at some of those stills, and, you know, I got to be careful because I loved Hulk. He was one of my best friends. But that doesn't take away the fact that sometimes he came up with some really ridiculous shit, as did I, as do all of us who are in the business of coming up with good ideas. You can't spend a career coming up with good ideas and getting paid for it without coming up with some bad ones along the way. This was one of those. And the reason I couldn't stop laughing is I'm imagining Hulk and Kevin Sullivan in a room laying this stuff out and bouncing ideas off each other. Because as goofy as this idea was in 1995, and believe me, it was still goofy in 1995. It's not like we're looking back at something 20 years ago and say, yeah, well, everything was kind of goofy back then. No, this was the epitome of goofiness even in 95. This is like Memphis kind of stuff, right? But both Hulk and Kevin had a lot of Memphis in them. And I don't know if it's because, you know, earlier in their careers, they had success with that kind of storyline in that market, or it's just they were having fun. I don't know what the deal was, but that was bizarre, bro.
Can I give you a theory?
I could have stopped it, or at least tried to, and I didn't. So it's not like I'm blaming anybody else. I'm not putting it on Hulk. I'm not putting it on Kevin, because ultimately I could have stopped it. And I should have, because it was downright horrible. But it's funny now. We can go back and get a chuckle out of it.
I have a theory about this I want to pitch you. And I'm not saying this.
You think they were both high?
No, not at all. I was just kidding around.
I would agree with you on that.
Well, they may have been, but that's a separate thing. I've had a theory for a long time, that especially when you look back at the NWA era, we'll call it the Jim Crockett Promotions era. They were positioning themselves like they were real wrestling, and the WWF was more the Hollywood stuff for kids. They didn't have cartoons. They weren't on lunch boxes and sleeping bags. They didn't have action figures, that sort of thing.
Yeah, they couldn't get any licensing or merchandising or any of that kind of stuff.
It was aimed at an older audience, you know, so it was more blood and guts and down and dirty. And I think that's why so many of our listeners really love it and gravitate to it now. But let's be honest, the majority of our listeners now grew up on WWF programming. They had the Hulk Hogan action figures and that sort of thing. So if WCW wants to be in that game and they want to aim to a more youthful, younger audience, then it makes sense that you get the hero from the other channel. That's Hulk Hogan. So if you know that this dude made a mint from licensing action figures, toys, lunchboxes, sleeping bags, just kid stuff, then it makes sense that you would try to aim some of his storylines and angles towards kid stuff. And I know this is silly, the whole Dungeon of Doom nonsense and the Yeti and the block of ice, but let's take ourselves back to 1995. Wasn't the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers one of the #1 syndicated shows at the time? Weren't they a merch monster? Weren't they a licensing machine? So if you're thinking about it from a targeting the children standpoint, and I mean that in a positive way, not a negative way, but we're talking about monetizing merch and the Hulk Hogan IP, it makes sense that you would have Hulk Hogan. Like if Hulk Hogan appeared in a Mighty Morphin Power Rangers in 95, would anybody have really been shocked? I wouldn't have. It kind of felt like, yeah, well, that makes sense. It's kind of on brand with Hulk Hogan and the type of things he does. So this to me is an attempt to set the hook for those kids who watch Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, who grew up with Hulk Hogan. Like, it's okay if it's a little over the top and a little silly, just like Mighty Morphin Power Rangers was. I don't know. That's just a guess that I think is worth discussing maybe.
Well, it's generous. Number one, that's a very generous take on your part, meaning you're ascribing some strategic or tactical, plan to a creative. And I'd like to think that that was the case. And I could sit here and pretend that it was and give myself an out, so to speak, for allowing it to happen. But I can assure you that was not part of any conversation. This was solely a Kevin, Hulk. They were in their creative groove and they both loved this idea and they fed off of each other. Here's you're partially right in that one of the reasons that we brought Hulk to WCW is because WCW had zero licensing. Our merchandising was abysmal. The number of shirts we'd sell at an event, well, we had to give the tickets away. How many people do you think actually bought shirts?
Right.
And the idea was, well, this is like macro, like looking at it big picture. Well, if we bring Hulk Hogan in, we'll get more licensing and merchandising deals. Kind of, yeah. Possibly, yes. Potentially, for sure. But a lot has to go into positioning yourself for those licensing and merchandising deals that take a long time, and that you have to be very targeted. The problem with the creative that we're talking about, the Dungeon of Doom creative, and why it didn't work from a licensing and merchandising perspective or from a television perspective, is because if taking your
theory,
your perspective, your theory, if we had a kids audience,
right,
then your perspective would be logical, and I would probably go, yeah, I didn't think of it, but I probably should have. But we didn't have a kids audience. Our audience was like 25 to 90. The TBS and TNT audience was not. Now we were trying to attract 18 to 39, but clearly we weren't there yet. Not with this stuff, right? So we're not satisfying our existing audience. We're taking something that is so unique. I'll be generous too. We're taking some creative that is so unique that's targeted toward kids, and we're going to put it out there knowing we don't have any kids, and we're going to turn off the core audience that we do have because they're not going to sit through this shit. So that was like the double whammy. If we would have had a children's audience and if we would have had some licensing and merchandising in place, absolutely your theory would be 100% applicable. But we didn't have a kids audience and we didn't have any licensing and merchandising in place. We just came up with a really, really silly idea.
SaveWithConrad.com.
My name's Rajiv. I'm in Sacramento, California. I came to Save with Conrad because I've heard Conrad talk about how he helps people all the time save money and the best route to go for getting some mortgages and finances done. And having heard so many different testimonials in the past, it made the most sense to go this route. We were in the market for a new house and we wanted to know what we could afford. So We spoke with Steve and then Diane to get through the pre-approval process to see what we could afford. And then once we were able to understand that aspect of it, that was when we were able to shop around for a house to get a mortgage through Save with Conrad. Everybody on the team was great. Everybody really explained everything fully to where it was more in like layman's terms to where I could understand it as someone not in the business or having shopped around for houses too many times. So being able to understand every step of the process and talking with everyone on the team about that was really, really helpful. And it made me feel really confident that I was going the right route. I would definitely recommend Save with Conrad to others. I know that sometimes people look at it and they go, oh, they're based in Alabama, what could they help me with? But I'm out here in California, and they were able to square everything away and get things done really quickly, as opposed to sometimes even people out here don't move as quickly as the Save with Conrad team. So everything was really well done, really efficient, and I would definitely recommend Save with Conrad to others. My name is Rajiv. I'm in Sacramento, California, and I was able to get into my dream home with SaveWithConrad.com.
That's number 212 non-equal housing lender. SaveWithConrad.com.